Some stories don't just leave you speechless, they touch the deepest corners of your heart. This is one of those stories, a tale of love, forgiveness, and a bond that seemed lost forever. Today, I want to share a very special story with you. It's about a young girl and a single sentence that changed everything. A sentence that silenced an entire courtroom and shook the lives of two people who thought they were strangers. Stay with me until the end. Because sometimes, someone else's journey can help us see our own lives in a new light. And if this story touches your heart, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories to life. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. It was a quiet morning in the family courtroom, the kind of day where routine cases of custody disputes or minor offenses were usually handled without much fuss. But something about this morning felt different. The soft echo of footsteps on polished floors, the scrape of wooden benches, and the solemn whispers among spectators created an air of tension that no one could quite explain. At the center of it all was Judge Rebecca Hart. Known for her no-nonsense demeanor and an unwavering sense of justice, she commanded attention the moment she stepped into the room. Her black robe flowed with authority, and her sharp gaze swept over the courtroom like a searchlight. Rebecca was not one to tolerate nonsense, especially not from the young offenders she often saw. Across the room at the defendant's table sat a young girl named Layla. At just 12 years old, she seemed out of place in this imposing courtroom. Her small frame was nearly lost in the oversized wooden chair. She wore scuffed sneakers, jeans that were too short, and a hoodie that had seen better days. Yet, it wasn't her appearance that drew attention. It was her eyes. They held a quiet strength, a resilience forged by years of struggle, but also a flicker of uncertainty, as if she was bracing herself for a storm only she could see. Layla had been brought here after being accused of trespassing in a gated community. A homeowner had called the police, reporting a suspicious figure. When confronted, Layla had no explanation for why she was there. The case seemed straightforward, just another juvenile delinquency hearing to move through the system. But as the bailiff's voice rang out, breaking the quiet, something shifted. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Hart," he announced, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. The courtroom stood in unison, the rustle of movement filling the space. Rebecca took her seat at the bench, her gaze briefly meeting Layla's. The girl's fingers clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white as she held on tightly. Their eyes locked for a moment. A fleeting connection, before Rebecca broke it, her professional mask firmly in place. No one could have predicted what would happen next. No one could have guessed that in a matter of moments, one sentence would shatter the quiet routine of this courtroom and change the lives of everyone inside. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that presses on your chest and makes you hold your breath without realizing it. Judge Rebecca Hart shifted slightly in her seat, her sharp eyes glancing down at the case file before her. She took a steadying breath, her voice calm and professional as always. "Layla," she began, her tone even and deliberate. "How do you plead? Guilty or not guilty?" Layla sat frozen for a moment. Her small hands gripped the edge of the wooden table, her knuckles turning white. Her chest rose and fell as if she were gathering every ounce of courage she could find. Then, slowly, she stood. The room seemed to lean forward, holding its collective breath. Every eye fixed on the little girl, who looked so small yet carried an air of quiet determination. Layla lifted her head, her gaze locking onto Rebecca's. Her lips trembled, but when she spoke, her voice was steady, louder, stronger than anyone expected. "I plead not guilty," she said. The room began to exhale, but before anyone could fully process her answer, she took another breath and spoke again. This time louder, the words cutting through the air like a blade. "Because you're my mom." The courtroom froze. A collective gasp rippled through the room, and then silence. An eerie, suffocating silence, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The prosecutor, who had been flipping through his notes, froze mid-motion, his eyes wide with disbelief. The stenographer's fingers hovered above her keyboard, motionless. Spectators exchanged stunned glances, their whispers barely audible. Rebecca's pen hovered above her notepad, her hand trembling slightly. For the first time in her career, she didn't know what to say. Her composure, always so unshakable, wavered. She stared at Layla, her expression frozen in shock, but her mind was racing. Layla didn't falter. She stood tall, her voice steady but filled with a raw pain that seemed far too old for a girl her age. "You gave me away," Layla said, her voice cracking as tears welled up in her eyes. "And now you don't even recognize me." Rebecca's chest tightened, an invisible weight pressing down on her. Her grip on the edges of her desk tightened, as though holding on could somehow steady the storm brewing inside her. The room remained deathly silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Every soul present seemed trapped in the gravity of Layla's words, waiting, breathless for Rebecca's response. But Rebecca didn't respond. She couldn't. Her silence hung heavy in the air, a silence that spoke louder than any words. And in that moment, it wasn't just the courtroom that seemed to crumble. It was the carefully constructed walls of Rebecca's life. Walls she had spent decades building to keep her past hidden. Layla had been arrested just a few days earlier. It was late at night, and she had been found wandering in a gated neighborhood. The streets were empty, the houses dark, except for the occasional glow of porch lights. A homeowner, noticing Layla walking near their property, had called the police, describing her as suspicious. When the officers arrived, Layla couldn't give them a clear answer about why she was there. She looked nervous, her voice shaky, and her hands clutching the straps of her worn backpack. To them, she was just another troubled kid, out after curfew, in a place she didn't belong. They took her into custody. Now in court, the prosecutor stood tall, his voice sharp and unwavering as he addressed the room. "Your Honor," he began, "this is not Miss Layla's first encounter with law enforcement. On previous occasions, she has been reported for trespassing and loitering. While no charges were filed in those incidents, the pattern here is clear. This young lady has repeatedly violated rules and disregarded authority. It's time for her to face the consequences of her actions." The words hung heavily in the room. Layla sat quietly, her head slightly bowed, but her fingers fidgeted nervously on the table. She could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom pressing down on her. Then her lawyer, a weary but compassionate public defender, stood to speak. His voice was calm but firm, carrying a tone of quiet defiance. "Your Honor," he began, "it's true that my client was in a neighborhood where she technically shouldn't have been, but we must consider the context. Layla is a 12-year-old girl with no stable home, no family to guide her, and no resources to support her. She wasn't there to cause harm. She was there because she had nowhere else to go." He paused, glancing briefly at Layla, as if willing her to find strength in his words. "Your Honor, what this young lady needs is not punishment. What she needs is understanding. She needs support, not a record that will follow her for the rest of her life. I ask the court to take these circumstances into account and consider her unique challenges before passing judgment." The courtroom buzzed softly as spectators murmured among themselves. On one side, the prosecutor's accusations painted Layla as a repeat troublemaker. On the other, her lawyer's plea revealed a vulnerable child caught in circumstances far beyond her control. Rebecca listened intently, her face unreadable, as the arguments unfolded before her. This wasn't the first time she'd heard a case like this. But something about Layla, her silence, her composure, the subtle tremor in her hands, lingered in Rebecca's mind longer than she expected. Rebecca froze. The words, "because you're my mom," seemed to echo endlessly in her mind, refusing to be silenced. For a moment her hand hovered over the pen she had been holding, trembling slightly. She forced herself to set it down and looked at Layla again, her expression sharp, almost cold, a mask she had perfected over the years. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said finally, her voice clipped, professional. The words came out too fast, too sharp, betraying the turmoil bubbling beneath her composed exterior. But the room was already shifting. A murmur rippled through the crowd, soft at first like a wave building momentum. The reporters seated at the back of the courtroom began scribbling furiously, some even whispering into their phones. One leaned over to his colleague and muttered, "Did she just deny it?" This could be big. Rebecca felt her chest tighten as the weight of 100 eyes pressed down on her. Some were filled with curiosity, others with disbelief, and a few even with judgment. The whispers grew louder, a low hum of speculation that seemed to fill every corner of the room. She tightened her grip on the edge of the desk, willing herself to stay composed. This isn't real, she told herself. This isn't happening. But it was happening. On the other side of the room, Gloria Adams, the social worker assigned to Layla's case, observed the scene silently. Her brow furrowed and her lips pressed into a thin line. Gloria had been in this courtroom countless times, but this was different. She glanced at Layla, who sat rigid, her hands clenched into fists on the table. The girl's shoulders were tense, her breath shallow, but her gaze was unwavering. Then Gloria shifted her attention to Rebecca. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something in the judge's eyes. A flicker of fear, quickly buried under her usual stoicism. Gloria's heart ached. She had seen too many children crushed by the system, by the adults who were supposed to protect them. And now she feared Layla was about to endure the same. Rebecca, feeling the walls closing in, rapped her gavel sharply. "Order in the court," she demanded. Her voice was firm, but it lacked the weight of conviction it usually carried. The room fell silent again, but the tension remained, thick and suffocating. Rebecca shifted her attention back to the file in front of her, pretending to read. The words blurred on the page, meaningless. She could feel Layla's gaze on her, piercing and relentless. And behind that, the quiet judgment of Gloria, the whispers of the crowd, the weight of a truth she had tried so hard to bury. Her carefully constructed world was beginning to crack, and for the first time in years, Rebecca felt something unfamiliar. A gnawing, undeniable doubt. But doubt wasn't the only thing she felt. It was fear. Fear that the truth she had buried so deeply was finally clawing its way to the surface. Layla hesitated, her small hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were her lifeline. She took a shaky breath, her chest rising and falling with the effort to steady herself. For a moment, it seemed like she might stay silent. But then she raised her head, locking eyes with Rebecca. "I've been through so many foster homes," she began, her voice soft but resolute. Each word seemed to carry the weight of years of pain. "So many families, some kind, some not. And every time I packed my things, I thought, maybe this time it'll be different." The room was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Even the reporters who had been scribbling furiously moments before now sat frozen, their pens hovering over their notepads. Layla's voice wavered, but she didn't stop. "Maybe this family will stay," she said, her words trembling. "Or maybe my real mom will finally come for me." She paused, her breath catching. Her hands gripped the table harder, her knuckles white, as though holding on could somehow keep her voice steady. "But you didn't come, did you?" she said, louder this time. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. "You never came. You didn't even try to find me." The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. The murmurs that had filled the room earlier were gone. Now there was only silence, thick, suffocating, and inescapable. Rebecca sat perfectly still, her hand resting on the file in front of her, as if touching the paper could anchor her. Her gaze dropped to her desk, avoiding Layla's piercing eyes. But the girl's words had struck something deep within her, and she felt her carefully constructed composure start to slip. Layla's shoulders rose and fell with each shaky breath, but she pressed on, her voice growing steadier with each word. "All I ever wanted was to know why," she said, her tone quieter now, but no less piercing. "Why did you leave me? Was I not enough? Was I not worth it?" Rebecca's chest tightened. She felt her fingers curl slightly, as if reaching for something that wasn't there. Her thoughts raced, searching for an explanation, an excuse, anything that could justify the unbearable truth hanging in the room. But there was nothing. Layla stepped forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, but the power behind her words was undeniable. "I just wanted you to try," she said. "Just once." Rebecca's hand trembled. For a moment her lips parted, as if she were about to speak, but no words came out. Her mind was a storm of emotions, guilt, regret, fear, but none of them could find their way into words. The courtroom felt frozen in time. Every eye in the room shifted between the two. The small girl standing tall with the strength of her pain, and the judge, a figure of authority now reduced to silence. Layla stood there for a moment longer, her eyes glistening, but resolute. She had said everything she needed to say. Slowly, she sat back down, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her story had finally been lifted, even if just a little. But the room remained heavy with unspoken words, the air thick with the truth that neither Rebecca nor anyone else could deny. Rebecca sat alone in her chambers, the heavy oak door shut behind her. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the murmurs and whispers that had filled the courtroom just moments ago. She leaned against the desk, her hands gripping the edge as if the solid wood could somehow steady her. Her mind was a storm. Layla's voice echoed in her ears, every word cutting through the walls she had built to protect herself. Why didn't you come? Was I not enough? The questions lingered, sharp and unrelenting. She closed her eyes, and the memories she had buried so carefully began to resurface. She was 18 again, standing in her parents' living room, the air thick with tension. Her father's voice was stern, unyielding. You've ruined your future, Rebecca. Do you have any idea what this will do to our family? Her mother, usually a source of comfort, sat quietly, her face pale, her eyes filled with shame. This is for the best, she had whispered. You're too young. You can't raise a child. You have to think about your education, your career. Rebecca had fought back tears, her arms instinctively wrapping around her stomach. Deep down, she wanted to keep the baby. She wanted to believe she could be a good mother, despite the odds. But the weight of her family's words crushed her resolve. A week later, she signed the papers. The memory of handing her newborn daughter over to the social worker was as vivid now as it had been then. Layla had been so small, her tiny fingers curling around Rebecca's thumb, as if pleading with her not to let go. But she had let go. Rebecca opened her eyes, the guilt pressing against her chest like a physical weight. She had spent years convincing herself it was the right decision. She'll have a better life, she had told herself. She'll be with a family who can give her everything I can't. But those words felt hollow now. She had built a career, earned respect, and achieved everything her parents had hoped for. But no degree, no title, no courtroom victory could erase the ache in her heart or the haunting question that had followed her for years. Was she happy? Was she loved? Did she ever wonder why I left her? Rebecca let out a shaky breath, her fingers loosening their grip on the desk. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, not as the composed, authoritative judge she had worked so hard to become, but as a scared young woman who had made a choice she could never take back. And now, the choice she had made all those years ago was staring back at her in the form of a brave, resilient girl who had every right to ask why. Rebecca sat motionless in her chambers, her thoughts still swirling with guilt and doubt. The knock on the door was soft but deliberate. She didn't respond at first, hoping whoever it was would simply go away. But the knock came again, more insistent this time. "Come in," she said finally, her voice low and uneven. The door opened, and Gloria Adams stepped inside, her expression calm but resolute. She carried a folder in one hand, and her warm eyes searched Rebecca's face for any sign of openness. "Judge Hart," Gloria began gently, closing the door behind her. "Do you have a moment?" Rebecca straightened in her chair, masking her unease with a formal nod. "What can I do for you, Miss Adams?" Gloria hesitated for a moment, then placed the folder on Rebecca's desk. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she sat across from Rebecca, her hands clasped together. "It's about Layla," Gloria said softly. Rebecca's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Gloria leaned forward slightly, her voice tinged with a quiet urgency. "She's been in the system her whole life. Bounced between foster homes, some good, some bad, and through it all, she's held on to one hope." Rebecca's eyes flicked to the folder, but she didn't open it. She kept her gaze steady, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. "She's been drawing," Gloria continued, her tone growing softer. "Hundreds of pictures, all of them of the same thing, a mother she's never met. Every single drawing, Judge Hart, is her imagining what you might look like, what it might feel like to know you. The words hit Rebecca like a wave, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she reached for the folder, her fingers hesitating before flipping it open. Inside were pages of carefully preserved sketches. Some were crude and childlike, drawn with crayons on wrinkled paper. Others were more detailed, showing a woman with warm eyes and outstretched arms. "She just wants to know you," Gloria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's all she's ever wanted." Rebecca's throat tightened as she stared at the drawings. The childlike innocence, the raw longing captured in each stroke, made it impossible to look away. Gloria let the silence linger for a moment before speaking again, her voice firm but kind. "You've spent your life helping people, bringing justice to others. But what about her? What about Layla?" Rebecca looked up, her composure cracking. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice strained. "You don't understand what I do understand," Gloria interrupted, her tone steady but filled with compassion. "I've seen kids like Layla their entire lives. Most of them never find the answers they're looking for. Most of them never get this chance." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But Layla found you, and this is your chance, your only chance to make things right." Rebecca stared at Gloria, her mind racing. For so long she had believed that keeping her distance was the right thing to do. But now, faced with the undeniable reality of Layla's pain, that belief felt hollow. Gloria stood, her voice softening. "You can keep running, Rebecca, or you can face the truth and give that girl what she's been searching for her entire life, her mother." With that, Gloria turned and walked to the door. She paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "She's waiting, Judge Hart, but she won't wait forever." The door closed behind her, leaving Rebecca alone once more. Her eyes fell back to the drawings, the edges of her vision blurred by tears she refused to let fall. Rebecca sat in silence, the weight of Gloria's words pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. Her gaze remained fixed on the drawings scattered across her desk. Each line, each stroke, spoke of a child's longing, of hope that had refused to die even after years of rejection. She reached out, her fingers brushing against one of the sketches, a simple image of a woman holding a child. The woman's face was soft, kind, drawn with the innocence of a child's imagination. Rebecca's chest tightened as she realized what Layla had seen in her mind, a mother who cared, who loved, who would never let go. But that wasn't who Rebecca had been. The thought pierced through her like a blade. She had spent years telling herself that letting Layla go was the best decision, that it would give her daughter a better life. Yet here Layla was, standing in front of her, still searching, still asking for answers. Rebecca had been too afraid to give. Her hands trembled as she picked up another drawing, this one messier, almost frantic, as if Layla had drawn it in a moment of desperation. The image of a faceless woman stared back at her, and Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. "She doesn't even know what I look like," Rebecca thought, the realization hitting her like a tidal wave. For so long she had hidden behind her robe, her authority, her carefully crafted persona. She had told herself that her work, delivering justice, helping others, was enough to atone for the past. But as she looked at Layla's drawings, she knew it wasn't. Justice wasn't enough. Work wasn't enough. Layla needed her. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes as tears welled up. Images of the past flooded her mind. The tiny fingers that had curled around her thumb the day Layla was born, the sound of her cries as she was handed to the social worker. She had buried those memories so deep, hoping they would fade. But they hadn't. And now, those same hands, those same cries, were reaching for her again. This time, Rebecca realized she couldn't turn away. Gloria's words echoed in her mind. "This is your chance, your only chance to make things right." Rebecca wiped at her eyes, her resolve hardening. She had spent years running, hiding, convincing herself that it was too late to fix what she had broken. But as she looked at the drawings one last time, she knew the truth. It wasn't too late. She stood, her movements slow but deliberate. For the first time in years, she felt the walls she had built around herself begin to crumble, leaving behind something raw and real. She picked up the folder of drawings and clutched it tightly. It was more than just paper and ink. It was a lifeline, a bridge to the daughter she had abandoned but could still find. Taking a deep breath, Rebecca opened the door to her chambers. The hallway stretched out before her, quiet and endless, but she didn't hesitate. With each step, she felt her fear give way to something else, something stronger. Responsibility, hope, and maybe, just maybe, redemption. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable, a silence so thick it seemed to press down on everyone in the room. Layla sat at the defendant's table, her small frame rigid, her hands clenched tightly on the edge of the table. Her gaze was fixed on Rebecca, unwavering and filled with a mixture of pain and determination. Rebecca sat at the bench, her eyes on the file in front of her, though the words blurred into meaningless shapes. She tried to steady her breath, but Layla's voice from the previous hearing echoed in her mind, cutting through her defenses like a blade. The scraping sound of Layla's chair as she stood sliced through the silence. Every head in the courtroom turned toward her, the room suddenly electric with anticipation. "If you don't want me," Layla began, her voice trembling but audible, "then just say it. Right here. Right now." A murmur rippled through the audience, quickly stifled as Layla took a step forward. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice grew stronger with each word. "But if you ever thought about me, if you ever wondered about me, why didn't you come? Why didn't you try to find me?" Her words hit like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room. Even the reporters at the back, their pens poised over notepads, paused, as if the weight of Layla's pain had frozen them in place. Rebecca's head snapped up. For the first time, her eyes met Layla's, and she saw the raw, unfiltered emotion staring back at her. She gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles turning white, but she didn't speak. Layla's voice cracked, but she pressed on, her tears threatening to spill but never falling. "You had a choice," she said, louder now, her tone sharper, "and you chose to leave me behind. Do you have any idea what that feels like? To wonder every single day if I was the problem? If I wasn't good enough for you to stay?" A gasp escaped from someone in the audience, quickly hushed, but it was enough to amplify the gravity of Layla's words. Rebecca's breath hitched. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to deny what Layla was saying, but no words came. Every excuse she'd rehearsed in her mind felt hollow and meaningless. The room remained deathly quiet as Layla continued, her voice softer now but no less piercing. "I just want the truth," she said, her gaze locked on Rebecca, "because I can't keep wondering anymore. I need to know why." The air in the courtroom felt heavy, charged with the weight of unspoken truths. Rebecca's composure faltered, her mask of authority cracking under the intensity of Layla's plea. She looked at the girl standing before her, so small yet so unyielding, and felt her walls crumbling. In the gallery, Gloria watched silently, her hands clasped tightly together. She could see Rebecca's struggle, the war being waged inside her, and she silently willed the judge to say something, to finally step forward and face the truth. Layla's final words broke the silence like a hammer shattering glass. "I'm standing here asking you for the truth. Don't let me walk away with nothing again." Rebecca's throat tightened, and for a moment she thought she might break. But she stayed silent, her hands gripping the arms of her chair as the courtroom waited, breathless, for her response. The courtroom was frozen in silence, every gaze fixed on Rebecca. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. Rebecca sat motionless at the bench, her hands gripping the arms of her chair as if holding on for support. Layla's words echoed in her mind, relentless and raw. "Do you have any idea what that feels like? If you don't want me, then just say it." Her chest tightened, the weight of decades of guilt and regret pressing down on her like a vice. For a moment, she tried to gather her thoughts, but nothing came. Only the truth remained, undeniable and inescapable. Finally, Rebecca let out a shaky breath and slowly stood. Her usually commanding presence now felt fragile, her shoulders slumped under the weight of what she was about to say. She looked at Layla, her lips trembling, and for the first time, her voice broke. "I was wrong," Rebecca began, her tone low and trembling. "I was so wrong, Layla." Her head dipped slightly, as if the weight of her own words was too much to bear. She gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles white. "I was scared," she continued, her voice cracking with emotion. "I was just 18. I didn't know how to be a mother. Everyone told me it was the right thing to do, to give you up so you could have a better life." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked directly at Layla, her gaze unguarded, raw. But they were wrong. I was wrong. The courtroom remained utterly silent. Every eye was on Rebecca, but the judgment that had filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by something softer. "I told myself," Rebecca said, her voice trembling, "that staying away was the best thing for you, that you'd be happier without me. But the truth is—" Her voice broke completely, and she paused, swallowing hard. "I was just too scared to face my mistakes. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really just protecting myself." A soft gasp came from someone in the gallery. Reporters lowered their pens, their hands still as they watched the scene unfold. Rebecca's tears finally spilled over as she took a shaky breath. "I never stopped thinking about you, Layla. Not for a single day. And I'm sorry, so sorry, for making you feel like you weren't enough. Because you were. You are." Layla's hands clutched the table, her knuckles pale, but her expression softened as tears brimmed in her eyes. The room seemed to shift, the air growing lighter as the tension dissolved. Whispers of sympathy rippled through the audience, and even the most skeptical faces softened. Rebecca took another deep breath, her voice steadier now, but still heavy with emotion. "If you can ever forgive me, Layla, I want to try. I want to be the mother you deserved all along." The words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, and for the first time Rebecca let go of the fear that had kept her silent for so long. Layla's lips quivered, but she didn't look away. Slowly, she nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks as she whispered, "I just wanted you to say it." The courtroom erupted in whispers, a wave of emotion sweeping through the crowd. Gloria, seated in the back, smiled softly, her hands clasped tightly as if holding back her own tears. Rebecca's gaze never left Layla's, and for the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar: hope. The courtroom lights had long dimmed, but the weight of the day lingered as Rebecca stepped into the quiet hallway. Layla walked ahead of her, small and fragile yet holding herself with an unshakable strength. Rebecca hesitated for a moment, then quickened her steps to catch up. "Layla," Rebecca called softly, her voice trembling. Layla turned, her eyes still glistening with the remnants of tears. "I want to try," Rebecca said, her voice firm despite the emotion breaking through. "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to be there for you now, if you'll let me." Layla didn't answer immediately. She simply stared at Rebecca, searching her face for sincerity. Slowly, she nodded, her lips pressing together as if holding back more tears. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca set aside the rigid structure of her carefully controlled life. She filed a formal petition to gain legal guardianship of Layla, a process she knew would take time, but one she was determined to see through. More than that, Rebecca began to show up, not as a judge, but as a mother trying to rebuild what she had lost. At Layla's first art showcase at the local community center, Rebecca stood in the back, her heart pounding, as she watched the crowd gather around the drawings that had once been Layla's private world. One by one, people admired the sketches of a faceless mother, a woman reaching out with hands full of love and longing. Rebecca felt her chest tighten as she realized that, for the first time, Layla wasn't hiding. These weren't just pictures, they were pieces of her heart, now shared with the world. When Layla stepped onto the small stage to thank everyone for coming, her eyes scanned the room until they found Rebecca. For a brief moment, their gazes locked. Layla smiled, a small, tentative smile, but one that carried more meaning than words ever could. Rebecca's eyes blurred with tears as she clapped, her hands shaking slightly. For years she had stood on stages, delivering verdicts and judgments with unwavering confidence. But this moment, standing in the audience and watching her daughter, was the most important decision she'd ever made. To choose Layla, over and over again. Rebecca didn't stop there. She made it a priority to learn everything about Layla. Her favorite foods, the music she liked, the little quirks that made her laugh. They started meeting weekly at Layla's favorite diner, where they'd share milkshakes and talk about everything and nothing. Each day was a small step, a piece of the bridge they were building between their past and their future. Rebecca knew it wasn't perfect. There were moments of hesitation, moments when Layla's guard would go back up, her pain resurfacing. But Rebecca didn't shy away. She stayed, patiently chipping away at the walls Layla had built to protect herself. For the first time in her life, Rebecca wasn't just doing her duty. She was living her responsibility. The gallery was alive with murmurs of admiration. Visitors moved from one artwork to the next, pausing to take in the emotions captured in each piece. Among them, Rebecca stood quietly, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on a single painting at the far end. It was different from the others. The painting depicted a mother holding her child in a gentle embrace, their faces serene, framed by warm golden hues that seemed to radiate love and safety. The details were vivid, the mother's arms wrapped protectively around the child, the way their faces leaned into one another, as if the world outside didn't matter. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She approached the painting slowly, her steps hesitant, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Standing before it, she couldn't help but feel the weight of everything the image represented. Layla appeared at her side, quiet and composed, though Rebecca could see the faint tremble in her hands. "I made this one for you," Layla said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca turned to her, her eyes wide, her chest tightening. "For me?" she asked, her voice cracking with emotion. Layla nodded, her gaze steady yet filled with vulnerability. "I drew it because I always hoped. I hoped that one day you'd come back, that you'd want me." Rebecca felt tears well up in her eyes, threatening to spill. She opened her mouth to speak, but found herself momentarily unable to form words. Instead, she looked back at the painting, its warmth echoing the hope that Layla had held onto for so long. Finally, Rebecca turned to Layla, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry, Layla. I should have been there. I should have never let you go." Layla's lips quivered, and for a moment Rebecca feared she might pull away. But instead, the girl stepped forward, closing the space between them. Rebecca knelt, wrapping her arms around Layla in a tight embrace. It was the kind of hug that spoke of years of unspoken words, years of absence, and a lifetime of love waiting to be expressed. "I'm here now," Rebecca whispered, her tears falling freely, "and I'm never letting you go again." Layla buried her face in Rebecca's shoulder, her small frame shaking as she finally let her tears fall. The room seemed to fade away, the murmur of voices distant, as if the world had paused to honor the moment. When they finally pulled apart, Rebecca cupped Layla's face in her hands, brushing away the tears streaking her cheeks. "You've always been my daughter," Rebecca said, her voice firm yet tender. "And you always will be." Layla's smile was small but genuine, her eyes glistening with a mixture of relief and joy. She reached out and held Rebecca's hand, squeezing it tightly as if to anchor herself in the moment. The crowd around them watched silently, some dabbing at their own eyes, moved by the quiet power of what they had just witnessed. In that moment, Rebecca didn't see herself as a judge or a figure of authority. She was simply a mother, and for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the gallery emptied and the crowd dispersed, Rebecca and Layla remained. They sat together on a bench near the painting that had brought them closer than words ever could. The warmth of the room seemed to linger, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the emotions of the day. Rebecca looked at Layla, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and determination. "You've taught me something I never thought I'd learn," she said softly. Layla turned to her, curiosity lighting up her tired eyes. Rebecca continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've spent my life trying to be perfect, trying to control everything around me. But love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Layla's lips curved into a small smile, and she leaned her head against Rebecca's shoulder. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the echoes of their shared pain and the promise of a new beginning, Rebecca spoke the words that would stay with them both forever. "Love isn't perfect," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. but forgiveness and effort, they can heal even the deepest wounds. Sometimes all it takes is opening your heart and taking that first step. Layla closed her eyes, her hand reaching out to grasp Rebecca's. Their fingers intertwined, a silent promise exchanged between mother and daughter. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey. If this story touched you, please give the video a like and share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay connected and discover more inspiring stories like this one. Your support means the world to us and keeps our team motivated to create meaningful content that resonates with you. Together, let's spread kindness, hope, and the power of forgiveness. Thank you for being a part of this journey.